This tutorial utilizes StreamDiffusionTD, a project by DotSimulate. It leverages stable diffusion image-to-image pipelines to diffuse new content when you send it in a piece of information or some art, or in this case, some movement and motion graphics. I broke this tutorial into different mini chapters and sections. The first one is about selecting the input content. We want to find something that's either moving or something that has distinct features about it. The reason being, we're going to be planning on isolating some of the moving parts or brightest pieces of the scene because we want to send that through diffusion. Next, we're going to start processing some of these effects to perhaps make them brighter or add some trails to it. It's going to give it something interesting. Finally, we go into the diffusion part, which is going to make new content based on text prompts. From there, we can then actually composite it back onto the master scene so it gives that added effect of whatever movement we've decided to diffuse onto. Finally, we can discuss some output and different ways of saving the file or spouting it out. So let's start with an empty project here. I have a few pieces of content that we can choose from that will help us in isolating what we plan on doing. So let me freeze some of these and we'll discuss what they are. So this right here happens to be a 3-second clip, as you can see. It's 208 frames of 1080p, just juggling some points. Now, these little LED orbs happen to be very bright white/green. We want to be able to isolate that. Here, I have a magenta ball, so this is a very different approach where we'll have to isolate this object right here. Next, I have a phone with a camera light. We're going to try to just check out the light and leave the rest of the scene. And then here I have some LED bars that have some LEDs embedded in them for patterns. So we'll talk about how we can pull the information from all that. First, let's start with this one. I feel this is rather easy and we can learn from this by applying other techniques. So on screen, I want to pull up the parameters by pressing P on my keyboard. That's going to show everything here. I can also hide it if I need to, but I like to bring it back so we can work with it instead of actually clicking on it, which can also bring up the parameters if we wanted to. Nonetheless, let's send this into a threshold top. Threshold top is going to look at things to compare, whether it's greater, less than, or equal to, etc., and what our field is, whether it's a color, an alpha value, an average of them. But let's just work with luminance. If I bring the threshold for what luminance is less of, then it's going to turn the whole scene white. We don't want that. We want to bring this up to a higher value. So it's just isolating the floating orbs here. Let's start with the 0.9. There we go. So as you can see, it's just taking the mask of whatever the brightest pixels are in this in real time, and it's outputting just the white pixels where it feels. Notice it doesn't retain any of the green color. The green color here in this scene is represented by what's going on in the reflections on the walls. Nonetheless, we'll fix this later. After we've identified just this piece, I would like to make a feedback loop. So we can start by bringing over a feedback. Now it's going to just take the last frame of what it saw, but it doesn't know what to do to it next. So we're going to give it some information and some tasks. Next, we're going to use a level top. The reason why we're using a level top is this is going to be the next piece in the chain, and then we're going to be adding other things after this, and then we're going to tell the feedback top that it has a target. And that target's going to be later in the chain. So we have to think kind of forward here. Now what I do want to have happen is I want this opacity, which is found in the post tab of the level top. I want this to be 0.9. So it's just a little bit more see-through than what's going on here, by about 90% specifically. Now I want to make an overtop so I can actually feed this underneath the master. We'll call this threshold the master in this chain. So if I plug this in, it's going to be making the master over this level chain right here from the feedback snapshot. It's not animated though. All I have to do is I have to assign this target right here. I can take this over and drag it right on top. And it's going to start feeding it in via this chain because it's defined here. and now we see trails. What's really going on is it's taking a snapshot of this over and over and over again, and then it's going through the pipeline and recycling it, each time making it 10% less opaque than its previous frame. So we have a trail of frames. Nonetheless, we can go back and start maneuvering some of these values if we want more or less here, but let's just keep it at 0.9 for now. This seems to be an appropriate value. Also, I would like this green color to come back. So there's a couple of ways I could do this. I could add a multiply top. And what a multiply top would do is would multiply this right here with the green from this side. However, it would still mostly be white. It's not giving me the green I want. And I really want to feed the green into the diffusion pipeline later, not just a white image. So let's actually take a constant, which will take all pixel information, and it'll actually adjust it to whatever I tell it to. So let's go to a nice green that matches the original image. So this kind of looks like what we're doing here. Now, the whole part of what we're going to be doing later in the chain is compositing these two. So if I put an add top right here, you're going to see that this plus this, just for demo purposes, kind of gives us trails. So we know that we're in the right direction if we've gotten this far. I can remove this now. I also like to keep this threshold in 32-bit. The reason being, once it goes into this feedback top here, it's going to give me more granular control over what the values mean. Another interesting trick is if I take these three by holding down Shift on my keyboard, and I right click and I collapse the selected, it actually turns it into a base. Now, the network didn't disappear, it's actually just inside the base doing its job. From the input here and the output there, it's going through the pipeline that I collapsed. And you can see the input tab here and output tab there. What's more interesting is if I come over here to the actual palette tool, and then I click on image filters, I go down to feedback, and I can put this right here into my network. Now it comes preloaded with a banana, but if I make a null right here, and I output this on this side, you'll notice that it's doing the same thing as my base. So basically the palette already has a feedback in it. Even more interesting, if we go inside to the banana demo that they have here, you'll see a very familiar feedback into level, which is at 0.9% because it inherited it from the parent value, and it has the over, which is recycling once again back into the feedback. It's the same network. However, there is a difference. Here I get different kind of controls like reset and opacity and dry wet mix. My base doesn't have that. So we can always add that. We can come here to the base, we right click on it, and we go to customize component. Now we have the component editor in play. Let's hop right back inside the base and let's go to my level here. Remember this opacity value that I was messing with earlier, set at 0.9. I can take the word opacity and drag it right into the parameters as a new master. So whatever's happening here in the component editor is going to control this. So you can kind of see that it inherited the parent once again. Now its parent is the actual master base. So if you go to post right here, it inherited the name from the actual tab of the level, and the level top's opacity can now be controlled. So right here on this base, I can control the very output of how long the trails are. This would be infinite trails. This would obviously be 0 trails, but I like 0.9 for now because it gives us the content that we need. So I'm going to actually set this aside. We can make a null top. Another interesting trick is if we take a select top and dump this in, now whatever's happening here, this is going to be carried. This is very helpful if you want to put this at different parts of your network, different places where you don't want to run wires all the way to it. You now have a select top. It works the same as any other select operator, like a select chop as well. It's very handy when you start getting more complex. Let's move on to the other pieces of content now, because we kind of learned how to isolate, bring in just the motion pieces from the brightest parts of the screen. We have our little feedback loop, which is responsible for making trails. Here we changed some of the color so it's green. Let's duplicate some of this now. And let's see what we have here. So I'm going to unlock this and it's going to go back to motion. This is a few second clip of me just tossing a ball back and forth. It happens to be magenta. Now, we cannot apply the same principles of threshold, and I'll show you why. If we actually get a threshold here and we try to find the luminance, well, either it's all blown out in the backyard, or now it's just isolating just the houses. We've kind of lost the ball and the person. You see the siding and the skyline. So this top is not our approach here. We actually want to isolate the magenta of this ball here. Now, the threshold is just going to look at luminance or red or certain color channels. So we're going to need something a little bit different. In this approach, what we can do is actually take a chroma key. Now this is going to have values where we can actually see if we set a minimum for what the value has to be. It's acting like the threshold again. However, we get different controls like saturation. Find all the things that have a minimum saturation. Now it seems like we can get rid of some certain whites and darks in the scene that don't have much color to them, while leaving other pieces of color behind. This is going to become very important to us when we adjust a couple of things. Now let's look at the hue. This is going to be a range of 0 to 360 degrees here. This goes all the way up to 720, which is a couple of times around the rainbow wheel. Now, unless you've memorized where all your colors are, it's going to be very difficult to isolate your content and figure out, what color is the object that I'm trying to isolate. So for this purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start bringing down this value until some things just disappear. So my hue max, I'm going to bring it down to about 340. And now I notice that some pieces are missing, including the ball here, some of the fence, etc. So now I can set my minimum at 340 and it should make most things disappear. Now it definitely has. We can't see anything. Now this is great because as we back off this, the first thing that's going to appear is going to start being the color space of the magenta. So you notice that the ball stays as well as a couple of other things that are white. This seems to be acceptable. However, we have a lot of artifacts, but if we remember from our saturation, if we specify that the minimum allowance that you can have in this needs to have a threshold of minimum saturation, perhaps at 0.25, you'll notice that it just isolates the ball and there's no more artifacts happening. So effectively, we've isolated this piece. It seems like we've actually achieved something similar to our threshold now. So we can actually continue on our path. I'm going to take this base and I'm going to copy it, bring it down here. We can always view the base and see what it's actually doing. And you can see that the ball is getting tossed back and forth. So this is very acceptable. Now, just like we took the threshold and made it 32-bit, let's make the chroma 32-bit as well. Once again, what this does is it's going to give us more control over whatever we set this threshold to. So I can actually go a lot higher if I want to, because this is a longer animation. Nonetheless, it's giving us the shape we want. We also don't need the constant top here because the magenta is what we wanted to capture. So as soon as we make a null top right here, we're already going to be at the spot that we want. We know that we needed the constant here for the color change. We don't need it here. We might need it for the other ones, but we'll discuss that when we get there. Once again, I'm going to take a select top, which is very handy. I'm going to drag and drop. And now I got some portable content here. We can always combine this later when it comes time to recomposite. Let's move on to a couple of the other examples. So here I have my camera phone and I have the light illuminated as the flashlight. You can do this with any handheld flashlight, LED spotlight, or one of those pen lights, but a phone is usually handy. And the whole importance of this scene right here is that there's a piece of the content that is brighter or a different color than the rest of the content. Saw a couple examples of it here where I'm isolating the light or I'm isolating the color. This one should be easy because we're just trying to isolate the light once again. So let's apply what we've learned. I'm going to take out a threshold. As you can see, the normal value is still picking up some artifacts, so we're going to have to tighten this. It seems that 0.9 should be an okay value for this. I do see some artifacting though, so let's make it even higher. I'm going to bring this to a 0.95. Even at a 1, we can see that that is the brightest spot. let's bring this down just a touch. I don't want everything to be lost. So remember that when a comparator is set at less and not less than equal to, you can have this as a value of 1. And all values that are just not 1, no matter how close they are, even if the pixel value in luminance happens to be 254, it still qualifies. If I were to set this to less or equal to, right, then you would actually lose this if this value is high. Now there's no content whatsoever. So it's okay if we keep it at less, because it's just taking pixel values that are absolutely less than the threshold of 1. So therefore it doesn't lose this. So we want to make sure that we do have this in 32-bit, just like we did earlier. Now we should be able to follow the rest of the process here, where we bring down one of these and we use this as our feedback. Let's see, on the outside edge, we're going to have it be null. And this seems great. It's making its trails. However, I might want it to do something a little bit different. While this looks fun and interesting, I don't know that we can diffuse much of anything other than lines and shapes with this. So I'm going to hop back into my base, and we learned that having feedback into the level is going to recycle more and more. But what happens if I add a transform top to this? So I'm going to transform it, and what it's going to do is if I shrink down the scale like so, it actually makes everything go smaller and spiral towards a middle center point. Same thing if I make the scale bigger, it's actually going to spread out more and more, and it's going to give a little bit more interesting shapes. So I think we're going to keep this perhaps at a 1.01 on both, because it seems like a lot more is happening. So let's back out of this. So as you can see, this looks a little bit more interesting as compared to the original. And if I were to composite these two, we can take a quick preview to see what it might look like. So as I'm making my twirls, it seems to be floating like liquid in a direction away from my phone. Not only a trail, but actually something that's spreading out. This is rather interesting. I think for this pipeline, we happen to be finished, so we can make another select top here and drag and drop, and that'll be our third trial. Now for this last piece here, let's see what we want to isolate. I'm going to unlock it. So these are LED sticks. They have persistence of vision, and as I'm spinning them, they're making a pattern. If I freeze this here, you can see that there's some amber glow, some shapes, as well as some cyan color in the middle. So I want to make sure that I am capturing that. Now, we could always use the technique here that we talked about, but it's only going to capture white, and it's going to lose the color detail. Same thing here, we could use a chroma, but using a chroma key means that it's only going to capture one color. And I don't want to have to make a whole bunch of chroma keys and then diffuse all of them and recombine them. So we need a solution that is unique to the rest of them that we've done before. And what I would like to do is I would like to actually start with a threshold like we had before. I'm going to keep this in 32-bit to isolate just those shapes, which seem to be perfectly fine. But then I'm also going to use a multiply top like I suggested earlier. So let's find that multiply. I'm going to combine this with the original. And what this does is now it is effectively isolated the brightest spots by the threshold, but it's also combined them to actually make the color. So with this being isolated, and let me unblock this again so we can see, the pattern is actually being kept here. It's going to be really interesting is when we throw this through one of our bases. We can actually see that the pattern is represented throughout as a persistence of vision. This will be really great for throwing it through the diffusion later. Now, I don't think that we need anything special here. So let's actually just funnel this through a null and then another select. Now, with our selects here, what I'd like to do is I'd like to grab another copy of them here. And I'm going to feed the originals into these selects. Because the next part of this tutorial is I'm going to be combining and compositing a lot of these things after diffusion. So I don't want to lose these. So I'm going to actually drag them all the way over to this side. Now that we actually have our input, let's actually work with our star of the show, StreamDiffusion. Now, this tutorial is based on the fact that you should already have StreamDiffusion working and have gotten it run before. If you have not, then probably going to have to rewind and follow some of the links in the comments and stuff. If this is your first time encountering this, there's a little bit of work to do. This is not one of those things out of the box where you turn on and it does what it does. Here, there's some different things where we have to install. We then have to look at the models, which I'm using the vanilla settings here. Everything that came with is everything that I'm using. I'm not using any of the ControlNet or the V2V. However, in the second tab, I do want to make sure that I have image to image set. The reason being is text to image is only going to listen to my text. In this case, a dragon eating a peach. If I just have the text and I diffuse, it's going to ignore any of this input. Now these inputs here are for my image to image, and if I wanted a ControlNet, I could supply it here. And then there's some output about the information and status of what's going on. What we really want is the output. So I'm going to have a null here, and what this should do is it should reveal some diffused content based on my input. So as for settings, we're going to notice that there's a difference here. It says 512 by 512. We look at our output, right? It's only going to be 512 by 512. However, this right here happens to be in a 16 by 9 ratio, and it's 1920 by 1080. So with that big difference, we need to adjust our width and our height. However, we don't want 1920 by 1080. What we actually want is 1024 by 576. That still retains the 16 to 9 ratio. However, it's not a large canvas, but it is divisible by 64. So all those things match and make sense for the diffusion. I'm probably expecting something like 10 frames a second, which is okay because after it's all composited, there's going to have content that shows up on screen, and because of the motion in the original, it's going to match up. And we'll do some other tricks there to actually composite it later. Let's take this first selection, and that's put it into the inject here. And now I'm actually going to start the stream. What it's going to do is it's going to actually run in the background and actually make its own diffusion backend by loading the model onto my GPU. Let's change what that prompt is going to be. For the green content, I kind of want to do some anime faces. Let's see, perhaps with some fire, cartoon, animation, and style of Russ Mills. This seems pretty interesting. My reasoning being here, the anime faces is gonna pretty much be the content. I got fire, I got cartoon. Let's do green fire because we're using green content. We want to iterate upon that. The animation styles, it's going to kind of give you some cartoony fire. It's going to be animated. It's not actually animating as in it's not a video, but it's going to give you that feel. And the style is Russ Mills, which is he's known for his magazines and facial art in diffusion. So it's going to really start to make faces. Now, when I hit the stream button, it's going to start to load up everything that I need to. However, I have this step set at 1. So what's going to end up happening is it's going to pretty much ignore my input, and it's just going to give me whatever it thinks as an output is. So there, I can kind of see some movement, but it's just not represented. So let's crank this up all the way. So we have the steps up at 49, and we can kind of see that it's just a 1-to-1 right now. Whatever it's being input is kind of what's getting out. So obviously we need to drag this back down to a sweet spot where it's just about diffusing content, like so, like a face that we wanted, but it's also indicative of what we are juggling earlier. Now, I find something perhaps for this kind of content, something around a 20 seems okay. because it's representing the juggling of the green trails. However, you definitely get faces and shapes. The other flaw with what's going on here is it's giving the same shape and style over and over again. Nothing's new. It's also going to be a problem because this is a 3-second clip of me just juggling over and over again. So nothing really happens. So every 3 seconds, it's just going to kind of repeat. So we don't need to keep diffusing this live if that was the case. Or we could come up with a clever way where we can actually change what happens every couple of seconds. We can achieve this by changing the seed number. So if we start jogging the seed, you can see that it's shifting through all kinds of different faces and animations. The way to automate this is we can type in something like ABS, which is the absolute time since this program is running, and we can do it by the second. So every second, seconds is plural, every second that passes, it jogs the seed up by 1 numerical unit. Now the seed is constantly changing. That just happens to be the noise that it starts with before it diffuses, and you can actually see that each pattern is changing over and over again. This is our output. So we're almost ready for compositing. Now, if you remember, I dragged this over earlier because this is the corresponding video. Now, there is something interesting going on here. As I remember, I wanted to have a good frame rate. This happens to be 13 frames a second. Mind you, there's a lot of busy things happening in the scene, and I have different trails and everything going on. I'm also recording this tutorial, so it's putting a little bit of strain, but it's okay. It seems to be performing quite well for what's expected. It matches the speed and the pace. However, because all of that went through the pipeline, but this did not, and a select top has no memory storage, it's just representing exactly what the source is. This is in real time, and this is a couple of frames behind. So we actually have to align it. The best way to do that is to make a cache top. So I'm going to take a cache top here. Now the way a cache top works is it's going to have a cache size that's 32 frames it's storing. So it's writing directly to the GPU 32 of the last frames in order, and it's outputting the 0th frame. So frame 0 is a 1-to-1 ratio of whatever went into it is what it's showing. We don't need all 32 frames. I only think we need 5. Now it's going to save the last 5 frames. It's kind of looking behind. So when you see something instantly, it also has the last 5 things historically by frame of what happened. The way that you show a different frame here is by actually bringing this down in index. So we have an index of 4. This is now going to be 4 frames behind the other. I can even make a difference top so we can actually see. So the difference between this and this, you can kind of see that it's trailing behind. Now if I adjust the cache here, and I can bring this back to 3 frames, 2 frames, 1 frame is minimal delay, and obviously at 0, it's a 1-to-1, so there is no difference. The whole screen is black. Let's bring this back to 4. However, we're not going to be using a difference top. We want to actually use an add top. So I'm going to place an add top in my scene. It doesn't matter the order since they're additive. And now we can notice that as I'm juggling, there's that diffused face content. So I believe that this right here is ready. And we'll just save that as a null. And we'll talk about outputting it later. But that's the whole composition step. There is different ways that we could have composed this, and if we wanted a composite top, we could have. Let's move on to some of our other content here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop with this here, and I'm going to recycle this for other purposes. I don't want multiple stream diffusions open because although I could assign it to load one model and allocate it across, it's not practical to have this as multiple different toxes over and over, especially when you're going to be running different endpoints or ports that you want to have open. It'll just tell you that the port is occupied. So to be efficient, I'm going to unplug this just for now and let this do its content later. Let's move on to the next one. Now here we have magenta ball. Let's come up with some kind of new prompt, because if I just put this in here, then it's just going to try to make the faces from before, and I don't think that's going to match the content that I'm going for. So let's change this perhaps to magenta spheres, perhaps in style of Octane Render, and PBR Unreal Engine. So we should get something interesting. So it's making this kind of shape. Now, obviously, we can bring it up or down. If we bring it down here, then we get this kind of going on, and every second it's changing its seed. And if we bring it up all the way, then we're just getting this trail. So we're going to have to find the step size that works for us. I kind of like this. It looks interesting for what's happening. Now we can find a different way of compositing. So what I would like to do here is I would actually like to bring back that chroma key. Because if I set the value needs to at least have something more than 0, hence all the black, I can just isolate this. So it kind of looks like paint strokes, really. So then when I go to actually composite this with the original, I can use an overtop. So I want this here and that to be over it. So you can kind of see as it's going, wherever the ball is, it's actually diffusing content. However, remind you, it is going to be behind. So let's add a cache top so we can catch up. Once again, we don't need 32, we probably just need 4. Let's do a -4 here for the output index. Let's see if it lines up better. It seems to. Could probably even use more. So let's do 5 here. And bring this down to -5. So there we go. Wherever the ball happens to be, that happens to be. Now we can also do something interesting if we wanted to. We can bring in something from our palette with bloom, perhaps. And if I add this into a bloom top, or a bloom component rather, I can bring the threshold way down. I can change this to magenta, turn off the ramp, bring up the intensity a bit. And this might make for some more interesting content because now it seems to be glowing. Now this is just available in the palette. There are different ways to do this with just a regular bloom top instead of the component, but it kind of makes for interesting content here. We can also mess a little bit with the parameters of the diffusion. So let's say I wanted something perhaps like flamingos. It's going to change this to actually have more feathers and everything else, as you can see. I bring the steps down, and wherever I'm tossing this is actually diffusing some flamingos. A quick little adjustment of our chroma key here to ensure that there's no black spots in it. And now you can see that there's content of actually juggling flamingos, I suppose. Now, mind you, the seed is going to be jogging every time, so this is going to be non-repeating as the seed number is continuously jogging up from the absolute time. So every second it's doing that. Knowing that I'm getting 13 frames a second, it means that it gets 13 frames of diffusion before it changes. I can also scale this number down because it's multiplicative. It's actually a number that's being represented, not a string. So I can times this by, let's say, 0.1. And what that's going to do is just about every 10 seconds, it's going to actually change the seed up by 1. The seed, it has to be an integer. It's a whole number. There's no such thing as micro seeds or anything like that. So this stays in one flavor for about 10 seconds. If I want it to change every 3 seconds, that's, appropriate as well. We'll just do something like this, and every 3 seconds it should change. It'll give you more interesting content without becoming too stale. So you can get used to some of the flamingos here, and as I'm juggling, it keeps on changing and diffusing different kind of flamingos. So that's another interesting use case there. Let's move on to this trail here. This seems interesting as well. So I'm going to disconnect this because I want to recycle my stream diffusion. I'm going to use this as the input, and now this seems very different. Although it is drawing what it's trying to do with flamingos, because it's the old prompt that I had here before, it seems to be struggling because there's just not enough content that's happening right here. So we're going to try to adjust that. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to make something like many tiny white flowers and vines, comma, ivy. And now it's going to actually start to draw this ivy. Now, if I bring this down a little bit, it's going to start to draw it at its own discretion. And this is not what we want because it has nothing to do with the original scene. It has a little bit to do with it, but I don't remember dragging my phone camera in this direction. I remember more of this. So I'm going to bring this down until there's an appropriate amount of flowers happening, but not so much. I also want to actually bring this up to 2. The reason why I'm doing this is I want this to change every half of a second. So there's much more interesting content happening more frequently and change. Now, if we go back and we have our original right here, I'm going to grab a cache top because I know that I'm probably going to need it. And then we can output the null here so we can see how this works. Now, mind you, if I just use an overtop right now, it's going to try to just compete with it, and you'd only get one scene or another because there's no alpha. An overtop is only going to work if one is alpha, for instance. So if I use an add top, it's going to add the flowers, but only as an overlay. That might not be ideal either. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my chroma, because there happens to be a lot of black background and negative space here. So we can actually go to the value, and I want to assign that it needs to have at least a minimal value here. So it's going to knock out all the dark colors, and it's going to only give us the actual diffuse stuff like how we had the trails in the first place. So let's add these two together. And we can use an over now because we have alpha on the top layer. And as we can see, I now have my phone, and as I'm trailing it around, it's making flowers and diffusion patterns. Now we can always change this because we do have the ability to alter this color like we did before. So let's add a constant in here. Now I'm going to change this color to a deep red. And in doing so, I want to have, instead of many tiny white flowers, I want to have many tiny roses. Now what this is going to do is when I come back here, you can see that it's actually trying to make these red vines and roses. I can bring down my color a little bit more from my chroma key rather. And instead of vines and ivy, I can make thorns. So as you can see, as I'm drawing, these rose and thorn-like patterns are just coming from my phone. Let's remove this constant so it's white again. And let's do lightning bolts and clouds and see what it diffuses from that point on. So now it looks like lightning is coming from my phone. As I adjust this back down, you're going to see that there's more kind of like a bolt action. As I'm drawing with my phone, I'm only running on 10 steps. And it's drawing a lot of these shapes. If I bring down the chroma pattern here, it'll start showing more of the black lines all around it. More interesting if I have something like anime, cartoon, cell shaded lightning bolts. We'll see that it takes a little bit more of a cartoon and less realistic sense here. So as it's drawing through, it seems to have 10 as the sweet spot. I can also change how rapidly the seed moves. Now, obviously, drawing flowers, you want to have more consistency. However, if I change the seed perhaps at 5 times a second, you'll get a lot more changing lightning bolts. The reason being, almost every 2 frames, it's actually changing what is being diffused. So for this use case, that's the best way to get that out of overlaying some diffused content from StreamDiffusionTD. Let's move on to our last use case here. I'm going to disconnect this once again, so I can recycle it for this. Now here we have a pattern. And to me this looks like flowers, but there's like a tribal element to it. So what I want to do is I want to bring this in. Now this is going to try to make the lightning bolts and all that jazz. We don't want that. We also don't want it to change that rapidly. So I'm going to bring this down to 0.5. So now it's slowly moving. It's going to be changing every 2 seconds, which is fine. But for the prompt, let's go with something like a sunflower. But I want it to be tribal. Want to have like a fractal element to it. Maybe something in style of Alex Gray. Oh, that's very interesting. Now let's see if it looks better if there's more diffusion or less. So this is full diffusion. It's almost ignoring the input. And then the opposite vector is just the original video. So let's dial it back down until we're getting kind of a mix of the two. So this looks fair. I'm starting to see definitely the flower patterns. And it is changing every 2 seconds. And let's actually additively composite this onto our original. So we're going to add a null right here. I'm going to take the original. We know that we have to put a catch top here. I'm going to bring this back down to 5. -5 seems to be okay here. And let's see how just adding this works right out of the box. So as I'm spinning the LED poi, it's diffusing that content in a stream of different flowers. Let's try something a little bit different. We can do perhaps, and I'll keep this on screen as a background so we can actually see it changing. Let's do some fire. Just plain old fire. So while this is technically giving us some flames and shapes, it's non-distinct. So we're going to have it more definition than just the word fire. So I'm going to go fire, flames, vivid. What else? You can always do an 8K. And embers. So glowing, fire, flames. I know, this works. Steampunk. I was a little bit inspired to see some of the gears and cogs and wheels. There we go. So if I turn this all the way up like this, then we get the original. And if I turn it all the way back down, then we get something like this. Well, let's find the happy medium between the two. And now we have that diffused content as an overlay here. Kind of gives you the flames, gives you some gears and wheels and cogs because of the steampunk element. Almost has kind of a smoky look as well. There's obviously a lot of speed happening here. What's interesting is I can also slow down the input video if I need to. So this is playing at speed 1. If I slow this down to speed 0.5, it's a little bit slower. Let's bring it down half speed at 0.5. Now obviously my trails are going to be a little bit shorter, but by the time it diffuses, we're going to have a lot more time for it to fill out some detail as I'm spinning. Now obviously you can't do this in real time if your input is a camera. So just assuming that this was real captured footage, perhaps at a festival or a backyard like I'm in, then you can expect that your content should look like this. So let's go back to the original here. I'm going to disconnect these, and I know that I wanted some anime faces, green fire. and style of Russ Mills. That's why I think I had something roughly. Bring it back up to the top because we want this to be our input. And we feed it in here. And we get this. Now, there is one thing that I do want to mention as a simple trick. Because the more that this has, the diffusion has for context, as in more information in the scene, the more it can actually work with to identify. The way I think about this is if I just drew a line on a napkin and I told you, imagine this is an apple, you're going to have a hard time thinking that the little squiggle I drew was any more of an apple than maybe it is the stem, a tree, who knows, right? It's not enough context. However, if I used up the whole space of the napkin and started drawing a lot more across it, right, and I'm like, this is an apple, you'd start to think that, oh, okay, well, I can see it's round at least, and oh, maybe the top part is the stem nonetheless. So what we can do here is I can actually add a transform top. And I'm going to make this input bigger on purpose. So I'm going to use a scale of 2. So now this is twice as big. And as you can see, this is taking up more area in the diffusion pipeline. If I swing down my steps here, you can see more of that face. However, there is a fundamental problem here, is that now it is oversized and isn't matching. But that's simple because all we have to do is put a transform on the opposite end of this. And we'll bring this back down by a factor of 0.5 on the scale. And it works like this. Now, nonetheless, this is additive, so it doesn't care that there's alpha. But if you're not going an additive route and you need to have the full context here of everything in the scene, we can just add a simple RGB key, leave it alone, and it will make the whole scene fill in all alpha with black or whatever you specify it to be. Nonetheless, it now matches up, but what we've gained is a little bit more definition in the faces that are being diffused by the juggling, because we've actually given more context by enlarging this first, drawing a lot more larger faces here with more detail. As a matter of fact, I can type in something like realistic, detailed anime faces, and it'll give me even more definition. So if we look at our final output here, we can see that it's definitely trying to make faces almost at every single second, which makes for interesting content. Speaking of which, what can we do with this content now? So in some cases, we can just take this direct output and we can do spout out, and you can spout this into another program. You can do this in OBS if you'd like to. In OBS, what I can do is just add a spout to capture. And as you can see, I just added it as a source and it's coming up full screen. That's not native to OBS or recording software, but you can add it as a plugin for Spout. And I do believe it is Windows specific. Mac would be using Siphon instead. It seems to be the same thing. But nonetheless, I'm running in Windows right now, version of Touchdesigner 12.120, and I'm on a Windows 11 machine, 64-bit, etc. So with that, Spout is going to be my friend for this plugin. Nonetheless, if you don't want to Spout capture, you could always send this in via NDI or using Spout into another software. Whatever VJ input that you might need for ins and outs, that could be something that you start at the beginning of your pipeline here, where your input happens to be exactly that. Or just for the output if you're going into a software afterwards that you need to project. Nonetheless, we can also save this output if you don't want to record it in a different software. We can just use a movie file out, set the parameters that you want for recording, whatever style movie, etc. This tutorial is not so much about the different containers and processes for saving your movie files, but nonetheless, this will attempt to record this frame by frame because we are in real time. If we unclick real time, you're going to have to adjust things that are dependent on that frame rate. That's why I use things like absolute time in seconds instead of actually using the frame rate, because if I want to change anything and I want to render this way, I won't. If I send it back to real time, I maintain just about 60. Mind you, there's a lot going on screen. I have a lot in the background. I am running diffusion and I am recording. So this will fluctuate up and down. You might get some different values yourself. I'm running about 13 frames a second here on average, and that's at a rather large canvas of the 1024 by 576. Anyways, that is the tutorial that I've broken down on how we get from here or whatever content. We're going to isolate it. We're going to add some effects processing so it can make some trails, give it some good context. Here I enlarged it. Mind you, I had to resize it after the fact. I diffused some content using StreamDiffusionTD, and there will be some links for that. And that diffused content then gets post-processed and composited later back onto the original scene, so we can have something like this. And then we can spout it out or save the file however we want. I'll close down the palette and I'll hide the parameters so we can just see this running in Touchdesigner. 3-second clip repeating of me juggling these LED spheres, and it's diffusing content in real time. Nonetheless, it doesn't have to be a recorded clip. Once again, it can actually be something that's based on a live video feed or an input. Since I'm doing this tutorial, I didn't want to step away and also have to juggle and run back and also do the tutorial all at once. So I just recorded this clip as an emulation. But nonetheless, this is how we actually are able to make this.